Donald Trump is a street fighter. Donald Trump learned a crucial lesson as a child. Do whatever you have to do. You say whatever you have to say. Winning is everything. Donald Trump is a major deal maker, and he has made his money mainly from Manhattan real estate. Trump, 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 Trump. His name is his power. You realize what Americans really loved was celebrity. If you were a celebrity, everything was possible. You're fired, you're fired, you're fired. And if people mocked him, Donald Trump was here tonight. He certainly would bring some change to the White House. You should fight back. I am officially running for President of the United States. Here comes the war of the Trumps. It was war, and they were determined to win it. You don't know what he's going to do next. You don't know what's going to happen to him next. This isn't another video about Donald Trump's time as president. There are hundreds of those. Over the years, I've surprised a lot of people. The biggest surprise is yet to come. This is the story of how Donald became Trump. Of all the men who've influenced Donald Trump, none have had a bigger influence than his father. Fred Trump was born in the Bronx to German immigrants Frederick and Elizabeth. After he finished high school, he took a job as a carpenter's assistant. He liked the work, but he wanted to be the boss. So when he turned 21, Fred incorporated a company, E. Trump and Son, named for his mother, who started the company before Fred was old enough to run it. During the Depression, Fred almost went out of business, but before he did, he got his big break. Fred built one of New York City's first modern self-serve supermarkets and sold it for a profit. He and his business partner used the profits to buy a subsidiary of a bankrupt real estate company for pennies on the dollar. That subsidiary gave them easy access to a bunch of properties that were nearing foreclosure. Fred bought them low, sold them high, and made enough money to turn E. Trump and Son into one of New York's biggest real estate companies. He passed his success on to his children. Donald and his siblings grew up in a house that had 23 rooms, and the family chauffeur drove them to school every morning. Fred also passed on his ruthless streak. Throughout Donald's childhood, his father always gave him the same advice: work hard, don't be weak, be a killer. Donald took it to heart. He bullied his classmates. He even bullied his younger brother. One day, he threw an eraser at his teacher. Fred immediately took action and sent Donald to a military boarding school upstate. It was a tough, competitive environment, but surprisingly for a rich kid, Donald thrived. He excelled at several sports and was named captain his senior year. In the yearbook, he was named Ladies' Man. Years later, Donald would credit his time at boarding school with teaching him the discipline he needed to succeed in business and politics. But he knew that discipline by itself wasn't enough. So he went to college, 2 years at Fordham University before a transfer to the University of Pennsylvania's business school. After graduating in 1968, Donald Trump joined his father's company. The first few years weren't glamorous. Donald and Fred had to roll up their sleeves and turn around some housing projects which were losing money. For Donald, it was an early lesson. Just because he'd been given lots of advantages, he still needed to work for his success. After a 3-year apprenticeship, Donald became president of the company. The torch had been passed from father to son. One of his first moves was to rebrand. E. Trump and Sons sounded stale and old-fashioned. A modern real estate business, led by a dynamic young entrepreneur, needed a glamorous name. So Trump rebranded it to the Trump Organization. It was an early step in the evolution from Donald to Trump. Trump moved into an Upper East Side apartment and started going to some of Manhattan's elite nightclubs, usually with a beautiful woman on his arm. It didn't look like it to most people, but Trump was working. He was marketing his most important commodity, himself. It was right around this time that he made his debut in another high-profile local institution, the New York Times. The Times embodied the elite establishment that, decades later, Trump would build a political career upon opposing. But in the early 1970s, he was anxious for their attention and approval. The first time the New York Times mentioned Donald Trump, it wasn't for a good reason. The headline said it all. Major landlord accused of anti-black bias in city. The story concerned a Department of Justice lawsuit filed against Donald Trump and his father, which alleged that the Trump Organization discriminated against African Americans. Even for someone who believed all publicity was good publicity, it was tough reading. Most of the lawyers Trump talked to urged him to settle, but that just wasn't who he was. Trump met Roy Cohn at a swanky Manhattan nightclub in the early 1970s. Trump was complaining to anyone who'd listen that he couldn't find a lawyer who believed he could win the discrimination lawsuit. Cohn offered his services. He filed a $100 million countersuit against the Department of Justice. Although it was unsuccessful, the final settlement ultimately allowed the Trump Organization to get away without admitting any wrongdoing. It was a win for Trump, and a lesson he'd carry with him for the rest of his life. Never admit your mistakes. Roy Cohn was Donald Trump's lawyer for 15 years. This is a picture of Donald and me in which he says, Roy is my greatest friend. Trump soon set his sights on something that could make his career. The old Penn Central Railroad had gone broke a few years earlier and left behind 3 prime real estate assets, the Commodore Hotel and 2 rail yards on New York's west side. The rail yards were the largest undeveloped tracts of land left in Manhattan. If Trump could get his hands on those assets, he'd prove to everyone, including his father, that he could succeed as a developer in his own right. He knew that if he played his cards right, he had a chance. He wined and dined the development agency's lead official. He held press conferences where he outlined his vision for the site. And thanks to his father's political connections, he met face-to-face with the mayor. After pulling strings for weeks, Trump got what he wanted, the right to develop the sites. Trump turned the Commodore into the Grand Hyatt. The Grand Hyatt held its grand opening today, probably the most successful hotel, one of them in the country, we feel. He knew that just winning the development rights wasn't enough. It wasn't going to silence his critics, who said he was only in that position because of his father's money and connections. And it wasn't enough to satisfy his own ambitions. If he truly wanted to be the king of New York real estate, he had to build. And not just anything, something big. So Trump swung for the fences. He promised to build 20,000 apartments on the site, more than his father had built in his entire career. All along from 72nd all the way down to 59th, we're going to have magnificent marinas, shopping, restaurants, everything all over the Hudson River. The local community hated the idea. They thought the proposal just didn't fit with the character of the neighborhood, and they were politically influential enough to block the development. Trump raged. But there wasn't much he could do. Full-scale attack wouldn't work. The situation required deft diplomacy that Trump just didn't have in his toolkit. So when the option came up in 1979, he had no choice but to let it lapse. It was the biggest and most bitter disappointment of his career to date. But in Trump's mind, defeat was only ever temporary. So he made a vow that next time he wouldn't let it slip out of his grasp. In the meantime, he had other things occupying his mind. Ivana Marie Zelnikova was a tall, striking blonde with an exotic backstory. A competitive skier and child actor, she married a childhood friend so she could use his Austrian citizenship to escape the Eastern Bloc. After they divorced, she moved to Canada, where she met Trump. A few months after they started dating, they got married at a church on Fifth Avenue on April 9, 1977. Their first son, Don Jr., was born about 9 months later. Fifth Avenue wasn't just home to the church where Donald Trump got married. He also wanted it to be the new headquarters of the Trump Organization. Trump had dreamed of building a tower on Fifth Avenue since he was a kid. To him, it represented the peak of glamour and power. The site he wanted was occupied by a luxury department store. In order to press his case, he kept calling and calling the parent company, asking if they were interested in selling the site. They thought he was joking, but he was serious, and he wasn't going to give up. Finally, after a couple years, the parent company's new chairman, who was looking to pay down some debts, said yes. Bonwitz is being sold to Donald Trump. Trump secured the site, but that was only half the battle. He still had to persuade the approval committee, which was made up of the same sorts of people who'd blocked his plans for the rail yards just a couple years earlier. Trump needed a different approach. So this time, instead of aggression, he pointed to the fact that reputable architects liked his plan designed. Not everyone was persuaded. The media class hated it. The construction of Trump Tower marked another big step in the journey from Donald to Trump. This is the greatest skyline in the world, so this is a great addition to your skyline. The completion of the tallest concrete building. And it marked the beginning of what would prove to be a highly successful decade. Hello, welcome to the 80s. Ronald Reagan, the next president of the United States, introducing Macintosh. We have a new formula for COVID. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life.
Hi, Donald Trump, shaky, spinach, Joe, foxnews.
The murder of John Lennon, one of the most influential people of this time.
Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The 1980s were tailor-made for Donald Trump. Greed was good, and Ronald Reagan proved you didn't need to be a career politician to become president. Only in the 1980s could Trump go from being a real estate developer to a national celebrity who bridged the worlds of finance, entertainment, and politics.
Oh, there's a lot of coverage.
The newspapers and magazines which had made fun of him were forced to cover his rise. He became a frequent guest on talk shows, whose hosts liked his charisma and his willingness to talk about all sorts of topics. Opening a casino added to Trump's opulent glamour. To many Americans, Trump, who had a tower with his name on it and a glamorous European wife, embodied the 1980s hyper-capitalist version of the American dream. You'll walk down the street sometimes that people will touch you just for the good luck. It's a strange phenomenon that's been taking place. But even though he had almost everything anyone could ever want, there was still one thing Trump wanted, but didn't have: the West Side Rail Yard. After Trump was forced to give up the option half a decade earlier, it had been taken over by a friend of his father's, a man named Abe Hirschfield. Although the redevelopment plan was approved, Hirschfield couldn't finance the project. It was partly because he had made too many concessions to the local government. But mainly, it was because Donald Trump was working hard behind the scenes to make sure he didn't get the money he needed. When Hirschfield eventually walked away in frustration, Trump bought the development rights and a second chance to move out of his father's shadow once and for all. The week before Thanksgiving in 1985, he announced his plans. The site would house nearly 8,000 apartments and condos, and about 600 football fields worth of TV and movie studio space. Trump wanted to call it Television City. Donald Trump would like NBC to move to this site on the west side of Manhattan. Why is it so important that NBC stay in New York? Thousands of jobs, hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes, and perhaps almost as importantly, and maybe more importantly, NBC has a name and image of prestige that you really just don't get with another company. Once again, the local community stood in his way. But Trump soon realized that his most formidable opponent wouldn't be local residents. It was the mayor. Ed Koch was Trump's mirror image. Each man wanted the same thing. They wanted New York City to be the greatest city in the world, and they wanted to be the main character. But they went about it in very different ways. Koch was a Democrat who described himself as a liberal with sanity. He despised the way Trump constantly tried to strong-arm the state into giving him tax breaks while turning the city into a playground for the ultra-rich. But he was growing increasingly dependent on the tax revenues that Trump and other rich developers brought in. Trump, meanwhile, hated anyone who stood in his way. I hope that New York City has a different mayor at some point, because I think Ed Koch is a total disaster. He's been a very bad mayor for the city. The two men had already fought a long battle over the tax status of Trump Tower. Television City was the next battlefront. How have you the chutzpah to say that this government has been anti-development? That's an outrageous comment on your part, and I can prove that you're wrong. Koch refused to give Trump the tax breaks he wanted. I would say he's got no talent and only moderate intelligence. If I've done anything, I've gotten NBC focused on by the city of New York, and I think that's very important. I think it's vital. Trump again found himself in the uncomfortable position of being powerless. He couldn't overcome the combined resistance of Ed Koch and the community activists. The dream of Television City was dead, and the rail yard site remained frustratingly out of reach, at least for now. Trump turned his frustration into speculation. He bought a fleet of planes from a bankrupt airline and started his own airline, Trump Shuttle.